Two Guns and a Knife by Esther Stoltzman. The house on the hill stood lonely, decrepit, and worn down. About 2 or so hours ago, a man walked into Mr. Smith's office to report suspicious activity. He'd heard screaming cut off by gunshots coming from that house. The house what used to be a brewery until about 1887 when the owner, Mr. Blackwood, disappeared. The building served as a house for his daughter Margaret and her 2 children until August 18, 1896. There was an intruder. A man had broken in. Both the children were gone, and the culprit was found lying dead in the entryway. He had a note in his vest pocket, a Smith & Wesson Model 3 in his right hand, and a gaping wound in his head, the contents of which were on the floor, ceiling, and walls. The culprit was never identified, his head and face mutilated by the bullet. The mother was found hanging in the cellar. Officer Walter Smith had been given this job. It changed him, it broke him, the things that can happen with a gun and somebody who has nothing to lose. Walter was cautious going back to that house. He knew there was something wrong with that place. It had been surrounded by death since it was first built. Walter was ready to go as he could be, given the circumstances. He didn't know what was wrong with that house, but he knew he wasn't going to die in there. He had his Colt 1903 pocket hammer, his Winchester 1894 lever gun, and a hunting knife. He'd made sure as hell he wasn't dying in here. Not here, not today. The door was unlocked, though the hinges were so heavily rusted over that it might as well have been. After some persuasion, the door came down. The house smelled of sawdust and mildew. There was still furniture, though it had all been ruined by the leaks from the ceiling and the rats that took refuge in the walls. Walter remembered the entryway very well. It was where the man had been lying, his blood on the ceiling, his brain and skull in pieces on the floor. He almost hesitated to continue the investigation. He knew what he was going to find. 6 gunshots and screaming were reported from this house only hours ago. He knew he was going to find a fresh body. Nevertheless, he pressed onward. Walter did a full sweep of the ground level. There was nothing. Walter went upstairs. This was where the bedrooms were. He checked the mother's room. It had aged decently, but it could have been in better shape. He was almost done searching, about to check the closet when he heard a loud crash. The noise came from the washroom. Walter grabbed his pistol, barged into the room, and emptied half the magazine onto the first thing he saw. He'd fired off 4 shots into a stray cat, leaving it unrecognizable. There was a broken vase on the floor by the windowsill. Poor thing had probably gone in through the broken window and knocked over a vase. Officer Smith recollected himself. He knew that he needed to stay alert. There was only one room left to check. He opened the door to the children's bedroom. Nothing. There was an utter and absolute nothing behind the door. It opened to an unnatural darkness, an empty void. Then he heard something. It sounded like heavy footsteps. He'd forgotten to check the closet. Walter cocked his lever gun and ran out just fast enough to see a large figure running downstairs. He immediately began pursuit, landing a few shots on the fleeing suspect. He followed them down into the former wine cellar, where he lost sight of them. Walls of damp stone brick lined the dark, moist, catacomb-like caverns of the cellar. The fleeing suspect left a trail of bloody footprints on the blue stone tiling, having been shot about 5 or 6 times. Walter followed the trail of crimson steps through the cellar. For either hours or minutes, he was losing track of both. He followed them until they suddenly ended, leaving nothing but a pool of blood. There was nowhere they could have gone. He stared into the pool. There was nothing special about it. Nowhere he could have escaped, nowhere the suspect could have gone. That was when a solitary drop of blood fell from the ceiling into the puddle. Walter looked up and saw it. It dropped down from the rafters with a mix between a thud and a splat. It was a massive, semi-humanoid figure, a mass of bone and tissue with hideous growths of clotted blood coating its awful limbs. It stood around 7 or 8 feet tall, with thick trunks of flesh functioning as legs. It sported a jagged, dripping, vertical maw-like cavity on its torso, exposing its internal organs, surrounded with splintered ribs resembling jagged teeth. Sprouting from its torso were long arms, which branched out into claws made of exposed bone. Its head was small relative to its body, with no features except two expressionless, beady eyes. Walter shot with his lever gun. He wasn't dying here. No way in hell, not from that thing. It began to shamble towards Walter. He shot it again. The bullets were hitting it, but it wasn't reacting. He kept shooting. The bullets were doing nothing. It just kept moving towards him, not staggering at the shock of being shot. It wasn't feeling pain. It just kept walking forward and looking into him with unflinching, unfeeling eyes. He shot in the chest, grazing its exposed heart. It allowed an awful wailing shriek, not of human nor animal, nothing of nature, but of its own. Walter aimed at its heart and squeezed the trigger of his rifle. But nothing happened. It was out of bullets. The creature was lumbering towards him faster now. He unholstered his Colt 1903 and fired, managing to strike its heart again, this time hitting it more towards the center. The tissue on its arm migrated up towards its hand and began sprouting stringy, red, whip-like tendrils, which grasped around Walter's hand and squeezed with immense force. It almost effortlessly crushed his hand, with what was left of it mutilated, and the pistol he'd been holding embedded into it. He cried out in anguish, bleeding profusely. He was going to die. The creature, still grasping it, pulled off Walter's hand before the newly formed appendages began crawling back up its arm and fused back into the creature. The flesh covering its chest cavity seemed to writhe like maggots, before a swarm of more tendrils burst out from under its putrid tissue, grappling onto Walter. It was trying to pull him inside. He was helpless. It was going to kill him. As he was being dragged into the creature's ribcage, he saw a gun fused to the inner walls of its chest cavity. The screaming and gunshots that were reported weren't related to a murder. He was going to die, and this creature, this abomination, was going to live. Unless, he thought to himself, he grabbed the hunting knife from its sheath with his good hand. The creature was pulling him into its ribcage. It smelt of death, it smelt of blood and burning sulfur mixed with rotting gardenias. It smelled of hate, it reeked of hell itself. As it dragged him inside, steaming bile began dripping onto Walter, burning his skin. It was trying to digest him. Once he was deep into the creature's chest cavity, he did it. He stabbed deep into its heart before twisting the blade inside of it. The creature spat him out and began writhing in agony, letting out its hideous shrieks and wails. It was going to die. It started vomiting out blood, bile, and chunks of itself. The creature's flesh was disintegrating, sloughing off from its skeleton. It left nothing but a pile of miscellaneous bones in a puddle of putrid slop. The creature was finally dead. But Walter was still bleeding. He was still going to die. His hand was gone and he was losing blood fast. His vision was faded almost entirely by the time he'd gotten upstairs. He didn't have much to live for anyways. He'd killed that thing and that's all that mattered to him. As long as everyone else was safe, he just didn't care. He smiled. He laughed to himself. At least the memory of the beast would die with him. He didn't know where it came from. He didn't know why it was there, and he was fine not knowing. Walter stumbled out the front door, still bleeding. He sat down beside a tree and closed his eyes. He was fine with the memory of this dying with him. It was finished.